things. We know, even from our ordinary experience of life, that there are many different ways in which we can look at the same thing. There are many different angles from which we can view it, many different points of view. Not only this, but we can also look at one and the same object, one and the same phenomenon from, as it were, different levels of existence, different levels of experience, even different levels of reality. For instance, we can look at a thing from, say, the standpoint of time, and we can also look at a thing from the standpoint of what we may call eternity, above and beyond or outside, disconnected from time altogether. In the first case, when we see a thing, or when we see things as processes, we see them in terms of space and in terms of time. And in the second case, when we see things as it were in the dimension of eternity, we see them not as processes, we see them as unchanging realities, as we may say, outside space and outside time. Now, when one says unchanging, one doesn't mean that those particular objects, those particular phenomena remain unchanged, as it were, within the time, within the temporal process. But one means that they are outside time, above and beyond time, in a different dimension altogether. Now, this sort of double standpoint, this sort of seeing things in time and space, and seeing them also at the same time outside time, outside space, seeing them as it were in eternity, under these two different dimensions, in these two different ways, from these two different points of view, this sort of double standpoint is reflected in the central thesis of one of the most important of all the early, in fact medieval, schools of Buddhism, that is to say the Sangharakshita. The Sangharakshita is the principal Hinayana school of India. It was a dominant school in India, so far as the Hinayana was concerned, for well over 1,000 years. And its teachings subsequently were very influential in China, in Japan, in Tibet, and so on. Now, people often wonder what the name or what the term Sarvastivadi means. And it literally means those who teach that all exists. Sarva is all. Dharma, asti means existence. So all things exist. Sarvam asti. So Sarvastivada, those who teach that all things exist. Now, what does this mean? What did the Sarvastivadis mean by teaching that all things exist? One might think it was pretty obvious that all things exist, so there must be obviously some more recondite, some more mysterious sense or meaning to their thesis that all things exist. Now, all here, the sarva, all, means all dharmas. And this, of course, at once raises the question of what one means by a dharma. The word dharma is one of the most ambiguous words or terms in the whole of Buddhist literature, the whole of Buddhist thought. When we say dhammang or dhammang saranang gacchami, here it means the teaching, the doctrine of the Buddha. But dharma also means truth. It also means law of the universe or reality. It also means an idea in our minds. It also means cause. And also in Buddhist philosophy, more technically, a dharma is a sort of ultimate element. And especially it has this meaning in what is called the Abhidharma. The Abhidharma is the more advanced form of Hinayana Buddhist thought, and the Abhidharma analyzes the whole of existence into a number of elements, a number of ultimate elements, irreducible elements, elements which can't be reduced to anything else. So it's a form of what Sarvapali Radhakrishnan calls pluralistic realism. he holds that reality is, as it were, plural. But if you analyse and analyse, you can get down to a certain given, definite, limited number of ultimate elements, some mental, some material, which are called dharmas. And the whole of existence, the whole of conditioned existence, according to the Dharma, is simply various combinations, various permutations of these irreducible and unchanging dharmas, or ultimate elements. So this is the Dharma point of view, and this is what is meant by dharma, a phenomenon in the sense of an ultimate element of existence, whether physical, whether material, or whether mental, or even spiritual. Now, the dharmas are, as it were, in a process of flux, or they make up a process of flux. They come into existence, they remain in existence, they go out of existence. Now, the Sarvastivadins maintained that though dharmas came into existence, remained in existence, and then, as it were, flashed out of existence, the Sarvastivadins maintained that there was all the time something, some element in them which did not change. And they expressed this by saying that in the dharmas there are some element, some substratum, some substance, if you like, which remains the same throughout the three periods of time. It's as though there was a past phase, a present phase, a future phase of that particular phenomenon, that particular dharma, but it was as though at the same time there was a substratum underlying those past, present and future aspects which lasted all the time, which was in a sense eternal. And therefore they gave expression to this insight or this understanding of the world, the expression sarvam asti, everything exists. In a sense, everything is existing all the time. The past phase, the present phase, the future phase come and go. But underneath that there is a substratum of each individual thing which is not subject to the temporal process. Now this is all a bit obscure and a bit scholastic, but this was the central thesis of the Sarvastivadins, and we can perhaps have some understanding of what they were trying to get at. They didn't perhaps express themselves very well. The whole procedure, the whole scholastic procedure was often very cumbersome, not to say clumsy, and they did eventually land themselves in a species of what is called substantialism, which in Buddhism is regarded as a sort of heresy. They got into difficulties, and they had to be rescued by the Madhyamikas, another school of Buddhist thought, a Mahayana school of Buddhist thought, who solved the problem with their doctrine of Sarva Dharma Shunyata, their doctrine that all these dharmas, all these ultimate elements of existence and experience, these were themselves Shunyata. Putting it another way, they are in their depth, both unreal and real. Shunyata, after all, is reality, which is beyond time. So to say that the dharmas are essentially shunyata is to say that in their innermost essence they are above and beyond time. So in a way the Madhyamika teaching isn't unlike that of the Sarvastivadins, except that the Madhyamikas perhaps were more skillful in their way of expressing it and more in accordance with the true Buddhist tradition. But both of these, both the Sarvastivadins and the Madhyamikas, they try to do justice to these two ways, these two different ways, in which a thing can be looked at. That is to say, that it can be looked at as within time, or functioning within time, as a process within time, and that it can be looked at also as an entity, if you like, a reality existing out of time. That one and the same object can be seen from one point of view as phenomenon, and from another point of view, if you like, as noumenon. But we may say that the Madhyamika had on the whole a much more profound approach, and they eventually identified the two. That the phenomenon is the noumenon is phenomenon, shunyata is rupa, rupa is shunyata, as the Heart Sutra tells us. However, all this, we may say, is introductory and also by way of illustration. For the last 2 mornings we've been dealing with Buddhism in terms of process. In other words, we've been dealing with it in terms of time. We've been dealing with evolution at lower and higher. which of course is a process taking place within a time, and we've seen that the Buddha, for instance, is to man, even highly evolved man, very much as man himself is to the amoeba. In other words, the Buddha represents the goal of human development, much as the human being, we may say, represents the goal, ultimately, of the amoeba's development. And then again, on a very much smaller scale, on the smaller triangle, as it were within our big triangle, we saw that just as the man of genius is the forerunner in terms of aesthetic sensibility and general higher culture, in the same way the Buddha is the forerunner of the human race with regard to spiritual development, with regard to enlightenment. So all this material represented by these first two lectures, evolution, lower and higher, the Buddha, man or Superman, all this material represented also in terms of the chart or the diagram, all this is very interesting and very important, but it represents, we may say, only half the truth. We look at things, or we have been looking at things these last 2 mornings, in terms of time, in terms of evolution, in terms of development, in terms of progress. So that's only one point of view. We now have to start trying to see things in terms of eternity. In other words, we now come today to the other half, the other point of view from which things can be seen, from which they can be observed. So today we are dealing with the subject of the Buddha, God, and reality. In other words, now we are trying to see, we're trying to understand, trying to study Buddhism, not in terms of time, not in terms of progress and growth and development or evolution from the lower to the higher, but in terms of eternity. We're trying to see the Buddha now not as the culmination of a process occurring within time. We're trying to see him today as occurring, as it were, outside time altogether. In other words, whereas for the previous 2 mornings our approach has been more evolutionary, if you like, more scientific, today it will be perhaps more metaphysical, even more mystical. We're all familiar with the main details of the life of the Buddha. We know that the Buddha was born in the Lumbini garden. We know how he was educated. We know how he left his home. Know how he gained enlightenment at the age of 35. Know how he preached his teaching, his discovery. Know how he founded his Sangha. And we know how finally he passed away. We know this, we understand all this quite well. But there's one thing that we don't always understand, or at least that we don't always bear in mind, even if it does occur to us. And this is the fact that the life of the Buddha, the biography of the Buddha, deals in a sense with 2 quite different people. Deals with 2 quite different people. One we may call Siddhartha, the other we may call the Buddha. And these 2 people dealt with by the Buddha's life, the Buddha's biography. These 2 are divided from each other by the events, by the fact of the enlightenment. Up to the enlightenment, Siddhartha. After the enlightenment, the Buddha. Of course, we usually do understand quite well that the Buddha's enlightenment was the central event of his life. But in what way do we usually think of it? We usually think of the Buddha's life rather like this. Here was the Buddha at home, you see, living with his wife and his child, and then he goes forth. So there's a little sort of ascent. He goes a bit higher. When he practices meditation in the jungle, yes. When he sits down at Buddha after 5 years, gains enlightenment with a little slope, and then like that. This is how we think, graphically, of the Buddha's life, as it were. In other words, the enlightenment is a peak with a gentle slope up to it, and a gentle slope perhaps down from it. So this rather illustrates the way in which we think of the Buddha before and after the enlightenment, the way in which we think of Siddhartha and the Buddha. We tend to think that the Buddha after his enlightenment was more or less the same as he was before, except of course that he was enlightened. And we ourselves, had we been around at the time, and had we known the Buddha, say, a few months before he was enlightened, and a few months after he was enlightened, we might not have been able to perceive any difference, any difference at all, perhaps. We would have seen after the same physical body, probably the same clothes, and we were speaking the same language, and we had the same general sort of characteristics. We might not, in fact, we almost certainly would not have been able to perceive any difference before and after. So therefore we tend to regard the enlightenment, the Buddha's enlightenment, as a sort of just last finishing touch to a process which has been going on for a very long time. The sort of hair that turns the scale, just that little difference that makes all the difference. But really, we may say, it isn't like that at all, not in the least like that. We may say that enlightenment, the Buddha's enlightenment, or anybody else's enlightenment, represents the point of intersection, as it were, of time and eternity. Point of intersection of time and eternity. Strictly speaking, of course, it's only a line that can intersect another line. So eternity isn't a line. We can represent time as a line, but not eternity as a line. So in a way, you can't really speak of eternity intersecting time as though it was another line, another time, as it were. It's ridiculous to speak of it in that way. So perhaps we should think rather in terms of a line, that is a time, which at a given point just stops. Now this so-called point of intersection isn't intersected by another line. The first line, merely time, just stops. Instead of propagating itself indefinitely, it stops. It disappears, as it were, into a new dimension. It's rather like the flowing of a river into the ocean. The ocean represents the new dimension. The river is time. The ocean is eternity, if you like. This simile is, of course, rather hackneyed, but it's still rather useful if one doesn't take it too literally, and perhaps it's possible to improve on it to some extent. Suppose we do that. Suppose we just assume or we imagine that the ocean into which our river is flowing is just over the horizon. So what does one see? One sees the river flowing and flowing to the horizon. But you don't see the ocean into which the river is flowing. So it seems as though the river is flowing into nothingness, flowing into a void. It just stops at the horizon, because that's the point where it enters the new dimension which we cannot see. So time is like that. Time just stops, as it were, at eternity. Time just comes to an end. Time is succeeded by eternity, and this is what we mean by enlightenment. Enlightenment is just like that. Siddhartha disappears, just like the river disappearing at the horizon, and the Buddha takes his place. This is, of course, from the standpoint of eternity. From the standpoint of time, Siddhartha becomes the Buddha. He develops into the Buddha, grows into the Buddha, evolves into the Buddha. But from the standpoint of eternity, Siddhartha just ceases to exist, and there's the Buddha, who has, of course, been there all the time. Now, this difference of approach in terms of time, approach in terms of eternity, is at bottom, or is at the bottom of the whole controversy between the gradual school of Zen and the abrupt school of Zen. You probably remember that in the early days of Zen, or rather Chan in China, there were these two branches of the Chan or Zen school. Those who believed that enlightenment was attained suddenly, in a sudden sort of flash of illumination, and those who believed it was attained gradually, step by patient effort and practice. And you may remember also that in the platform scripture, Hu Ning tries to clear up this whole controversy by saying that it isn't that there's a gradual path, and that it isn't that there's a sudden path or abrupt path. It's merely, he says, that some people gain enlightenment more quickly than others, presumably because they make a greater effort. And this is true. But one can also go rather more deeply than this. The abrupt realization, or the abrupt attainment of enlightenment, we may say, has got nothing to do with speed within time. When one speaks of the abrupt path or the abrupt school or the abrupt realization of enlightenment, one doesn't mean that one has speeded up the same process within time. It doesn't mean that you take the usual process of attaining enlightenment as it goes on within time and you just speed it up, you just get it through more quickly. It doesn't mean that whereas normally you might spend 15, 20, 30, 40, 50 years on the gradual path, you speed it all up and you compress that into, say, 1 year, or even a month, or even a week, or even a minute. It isn't that. The abrupt path, we may say, is outside time altogether. And sudden enlightenment is simply the point at which this new dimension, this dimension of eternity, outside time, is entered. So one cannot, as it were, reach this point. One cannot reach this point, as it were, of eternity by speeding up the process of realization within time. You can never get closer to eternity by speeding up your process of approach to eternity within time. Within time you just have to stop. But at the same time, paradoxically, you can't stop without first having speeded up. And this puts one in mind of the story of Angulimala, which I've often referred to. And it's a rather instructive story because it illustrates this question of these two dimensions. Some of you may remember that Angulimala was a famous bandit. Very long story about how he became a bandit. Sometime we might tell it, but it is a rather long story, so we'll skip over the early stages, the early chapters today, and start as we were in the middle, when Angulimala was living in a great forest somewhere in central India, and he had a rather unpleasant habit of catching people, travellers were passing through the forest, and chopping off their fingers. And he made for himself a garland of fingers, a garland of hands. And that was why he was called Angulimala. Angu is his finger. And Angulimala is one of a garland of fingers. Mala is garland. So he was called Angulimala because he used to chop people's fingers off and string them all these fingers into a garland, and he wore the garland around his neck. And at the time when the story begins, he apparently had 98 fingers, and he wanted to have 100. And the Buddha was about to pass through that forest, and people who knew about Angulimala, they tried to dissuade the Buddha, and they said that you shouldn't go through the jungle, it's dangerous. Angulimala lives there, and as soon as he sees you, well, he'll just have a finger off your hand. And in fact, that very day, Angulimala had been getting a bit desperate. His old mother was living with him in the forest and cooking for him, a devoted old soul, and he decided that he'd have her finger that day. He was fed up with dating anyone else. And maybe she used to nag him a bit, so he decided to have her finger, to make 99, and he'd be looking around for the 100th one. So as soon as he saw the Buddha coming, because of course the Buddha didn't listen to the village folk, he just ignored their warnings and just set off. As soon as he saw the Buddha coming, he sort of changed his mind about cutting off his mother's finger first. He said, well, I'd always come back and chop off her finger, so I would go and get a finger from this monk, this shamana, who has entered the forest. So it was a beautiful afternoon, and a very peaceful sort of atmosphere. There was a little trail just winding through the jungle, and the birds were singing in the trees. It was very quiet, very peaceful. And there was the Buddha just very meditatively walking along, very slowly, left, right, just like this, just thinking to himself. No one knows, of course, what the Buddha was thinking. Perhaps he wasn't thinking at all. Perhaps he was simply walking. So Angulimala just emerged from the shadows of the forest, and very stealthily he started pursuing the Buddha. So creeping up on him from behind, and he had his sword drawn. And as soon as he got near him, to spring on him, and before the Buddha could protest or struggle, off would come a finger. That was the idea. So Angulimala was just stealthily pursuing the Buddha, and hoping to get closer and closer till he was ready to make the final spring. But he was following the Buddha for quite a while. He noticed a rather odd thing was happening. But though he seems to be moving much more quickly than the Buddha, the distance between the two didn't seem to be decreasing. So there was the Buddha way way in front of it, left, right, right. And there was Angulimala going, left, right. But he wasn't getting any nearer. The Buddha was at the same distance in front. So Angulimala thought, that's odd. So he quickened his pace. And before, he was running. And there was the Buddha in front, left, right. And when Angulimala was running furiously near, he was no nearer to the Buddha. The Buddha was just in front. So when he realized what was happening, he just sort of broke out into a terrific perspiration with fright and astonishment and bewilderment. And he didn't know what to do, he didn't know what to think. So he would just make a last effort, a last sprint, a last dash. So he summoned up all his strength and he was dashing along. But the same thing, the Buddha was the same distance ahead. And he seemed to be going even more slowly, if anything. Right, just like that. So in desperation, Angulimala called out to the Buddha, stand still. So the Buddha turned round and he said, I am standing still. It's you who are moving. So Angulimala, who had considerable presence of mind despite his fear, a rather bold sort of person, he said, you're supposed to be a monk, you're supposed to be a summoner. How can you tell a lie? You say you're standing still, and here am I running like mad and I can't even catch up with you. How can you say that you are standing still? So the Buddha said, I'm standing still because I'm standing in nirvana. I've come to rest. And you are moving because you are going round and round in the samsara. So this was the reply. And of course, Angulimala became his disciple, but that's another long story. And what happened to him afterwards was also very interesting. But the point which this story illustrates is this, that Angulimala could not catch up with the Buddha because the Buddha was, as it were, moving or standing still, it's the same thing here, in a different dimension. Angulimala, representing time, couldn't catch up with the Buddha representing eternity. However long time goes on, it never comes to a point within time where it catches up with eternity. It doesn't find eternity within the temporal process. So Angulimala couldn't even have caught up with the Buddha, even if the Buddha had stood still. Even if the Buddha stood still, Angulimala could be running now, still, after 2,500 years, but he wouldn't have caught up with the Buddha. The distance between them would be the same now as it was then. He wouldn't be any nearer. But anyway, this story, though illustrative, is perhaps something of a digression. So let us return to our main topic. We've seen, in other words, that enlightenment, or the attainment of enlightenment, represents entry into a new dimension of being. Is not a prolongation of the old one, however refined. So after his enlightenment under the Bodhi tree, the Buddha is a different, even a new person. Not just the old Siddhartha slightly improved, or even considerably improved, but a new person. We tend, unfortunately, to think of the Buddha's enlightenment in terms of our own experience of life. What usually happens is that in the course of our lives, in the course of so many years, so many decades, we undergo various experiences, we add to our knowledge, we learn different things, we do different things, go to different places, meet different people, but underneath we remain, as it were, fundamentally the same person, recognizably the same person. The change is only peripheral. Whatever changes take place don't go very deep. Perhaps we're the same person now that we were 20, 30 years ago when we were a child. And very often this is the case very definitely, very remarkably, inasmuch as we do not succeed in outgrowing those very early, those childhood, even those infantile conditionings and attitudes. This reminds me of another little story. This just sort of floats into my mind as I'm speaking, but it is very relevant here. Some time ago, a short story. Like an author, I forget who it was, but it was quite interesting in this way, from this point of view. The story was about a woman who, with a student of the occult, the mystical, and all that sort of thing, and the esoteric. And she had become quite well known. She'd started her own little movement, and it had grown to a big movement. There were thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of followers. This was in America, of course, not in this country. And they all had checkbooks, and lavish contributions started pouring in. So she had a dream, a sort of wish that she wanted to fulfill. She had the idea of a beautiful temple. She wanted to build as the headquarters of her hotel a beautiful temple, and she saw all quite clearly in her mind the flight of beautiful marble steps going up to a beautiful marble portico, and inside was a multicolored glass dome and multicolored lights streaming down, and there was she, and a throne, you see, a white alabaster throne in a rainbow robe and a golden crown on her head, and all the faithful followers around, you see. So she saw this quite clearly, and being a woman not only of occult knowledge and mystical knowledge, esoteric knowledge and all that sort of thing, but a very hard-headed practical business woman, as one has to be to run a thing of this sort. She got things really moving, and she had the foundation stone laid, and as I said, after all, within the United States of America, and within about 6 months the whole thing was there, in all its glory, and she was installed as the high priestess, and yes, she wore the rainbow robes and the golden crown, and there were all the faithful flocking around, and that was that, or she thought that was that. Well, not very long afterwards, she had a letter from someone she'd never heard from for years, a sister. But apparently their ways had parted, and when she started going all occult and mystical, her family, as often happens, rather sort of disowned her, and she hadn't had any contact with them or with her sister for a year. So anyway, a letter came from her sister, and the sister wrote, you might be sorry to hear, but her mother died not so long ago, and the house has been sold up, and I've been clearing up. In one of the attics I found some of your things. I thought I'd like to have them. And I'm sending them by separate post. So after a few days along came a parcel, and there were some children's books, little picture books, which had belonged to this woman when she was a girl. So the story goes that she opened this parcel, and right on top there was a picture book. And the picture book, the title of the heading of the picture book was Mabel in Fairyland or something like that. And on the front cover there was a beautiful picture of a white marble temple. And there were 3 marble steps going up, and then there was a beautiful marble portico, and there was a rainbow covered. There was a little girl standing on a marble throne in a rainbow robe with a golden crown, surrounded by crowds of fairies. The moral of the story is supposed to be that all her life and all her work as the leader of this group and this movement was just the fulfillment of this wish which she formed when she was a little girl to be this sort of fairy queen-like figure. So this is just an illustration. This shows how at bottom very often we don't change. There may be peripheral changes. We may grow knowledge and experience in contacts. We may travel widely. But just as this woman was at heart still that little girl, craving to be the fairy queen, in the same way, we remain very often deeply and even dramatically, even sadly conditioned by our childhood, our infantile past. So any change that takes place is usually comparatively superficial. We may say, oh, we take to Buddhism, we take refuge in the Buddha, but the change is superficial. It isn't usually very deep. But the Buddha's experience of enlightenment wasn't like that. The Buddha's experience of enlightenment didn't represent just a little peripheral change in him, a change just on the surface. It was something much deeper, something in a way much more dramatic than that. More like the change which takes place as between 2 lives. When you die to one life and you're reborn in another, and there's a great gap in between. The enlightenment experience is more like that. It's more like, we may say, death. In fact, in some Buddhist traditions, enlightenment is called the great death. Because when you're enlightened, that's where everything of the past dies. Everything is annihilated in a way, and you're completely reborn. So in the case of the Buddha, we may say Siddhartha dies. Not that Siddhartha is changed. into existence or appears only after the death of the Buddha. We say the Buddha is born, but it's not really even like that. At that moment, when Siddhartha dies, the Buddha is seen as having been alive all the time, as we say. But when we say all the time, we really mean above and beyond time, out of time altogether. Now, to come back to another very important reflection of Buddhist thought, or even a metaphysical thought in the West, time and space are not things in themselves. We usually think of time and space as things in themselves. We think of space as a sort of box within which things move about. We think of time as a sort of tunnel along which things move. But they're not really like that. Time and space are really forms of our perception. We see things, we perceive things under the form of time. We perceive them under the form of space, and so on. And things, when we see them, or phenomena, when we see them through the spectacles of space, through the spectacles of time, when we experience them through these dimensions, then we speak of these things as phenomena. And these phenomena make up the of relative existence, of conditions, or what Buddhists call the and therefore we go beyond phenomena, which are only realities as seen under the forms of space and time. From young years to the year, from death to immortality. Now often enlightenment is described as awakening to the truth of things, described in terms of knowledge and vision of things as they really are, not as they appear. As he had transcended all those conditionings, all those psychological conditionings on account of which he might have been called a deva or yaka or gandharva or human being, he was simply a Buddha, one free from all those conditionings. And the same idea we find expressed in the first verse of the Buddha Vagga of the Dhammapada, where the Buddha says, whose conquest is not to be undone, whom not even a bit of those conquered passions follows, that enlightened one whose sphere is endless, by what path will you trace him, that pathless one? So the Buddha is a pathless one. The Buddha doesn't go on any particular path. There's nothing by which he can be identified, nothing by which he can be tracked or classified or categorized in any way. Often we find that people want to classify you, they want to categorize you. Now I remember when I was in India, one of the first questions that I would always ask anywhere by anyone was, what is your caste? Especially in South India, this is the first thing that they want to know about you. Are you a Brahmin? Are you a Kshatriya? Are you a Shudra? Are you anything else? What is your caste? And if they don't know that, if they can't classify you or categorize you according to class, they don't know what to do with you. Or according to caste, they don't know what to do with you. They don't know how to deal with you. They don't know how to treat you. Whether they can take water from your hand or not take it. Whether they can get to know you or not. Whether you might marry their daughter or not. All these things are very important. And just the same in this country, but here they're not so direct. You have often been stopped by some of the parties. He said, what's your caste? Without any sort of preamble. But in this country, people are much more indirect in their approach. So they're trying to worm out of you the same sort of information. They want to know, really, what sort of job you've got. They want to work out your income, maybe, from that, where you live, where you were born, where you were educated. In this way, by taking these various readings, as it were, these sociological readings, they can gradually narrow down the field, and then they practice just there. You are this, you are that. And then they feel that neatly pinholed. But you can't do that with a Buddha. You can't even do it with an ordinary, not really. Although you can try and even succeed to a great extent, but with a Buddha you really can't do it. A Buddha is one whom you can't pin down. You can't say he's this, you can't say he was that. But people like to try and classify and categorize even the Buddha, just as Upaka did. He wanted to know to pin the Buddha down, whether it was a Deva or Yaka or Gandhava or human being. And when he found he couldn't pin the Buddha down, the Buddha refused to be pinned down, he repudiated all those categories, then Upaka just didn't know what to do. And according to the account, he just shook his head and said, well, it may be so, and he went away. That was his reaction. Because he couldn't classify, couldn't categorize, couldn't pin down the Buddha. So that's what is meant when they say, in the words of the Dhammapada, that the Buddha cannot be tracked. He doesn't leave any trace. He's the pathless one. Just like the bird going through the sky. The bird doesn't leave any track in the sky. And if you try to track a bird by following its path in the sky and looking for signs, and what it has left in the sky, then you would have your work cut out, as they say. So just the same as the Buddha, you can't track him, you can't trace him, because he belongs to a different dimension, the transcendental dimension of eternity. And the same idea is expressed in the Sutta Nipata, where the Buddha says, there is no measuring of man one to the goal, whereby they'd say his measure's so. That's not for him. When all conditions are removed, all ways of telling are removed, when all psychological conditionings are removed in a person, then you know they're accounting for that person. And this is what the Buddha is like. And the same sort of idea is expressed more abstractly in 4 out of the list of 14 inexpressibles, as they are called. We won't go into all of these now, but these 4 positions are whether the Buddha existed, or whether it exists after death, or not, or both, or neither. And the Buddha was very often asked this. For some reason or other, some of the ancient Indians had a real thing about this. And they asked him to come to the Buddha and say, please tell us, when you die, will you go on living or not, or both, or neither? So the Buddha always used to repudiate all these 4. And he would say, it is inappropriate, it is inapplicable to say of a Buddha that after death he will continue to exist. It's also inappropriate to say that after death he will cease to exist. It's inappropriate to say he will continue to exist and cease to exist. And it is inappropriate to say he will neither continue to exist nor cease to exist. All these are quite inapplicable and quite inappropriate, because, he went on to say, even during his lifetime, even when he sits here in a physical body, the Tathagata of the Buddha is beyond all your classifications, beyond all your categories. You can't say anything about him. The Buddha is the person apart from whom you can't say anything, because he doesn't have anything. He isn't anything in a sense. And this is why in the Sutta Nipata again there's an epithet of the enlightened beings, a kinshana. This is usually translated as a man of naught, one who has nothing, because he is nothing. And therefore you can't say anything about him. It's very tantalizing for the human mind. But we find, again, that many of the Buddha's disciples gained enlightenment by following his teaching, gained individual emancipation, but they still seem to have felt that there was something very mysterious about the Buddha himself. Something they couldn't quite understand, something they couldn't fathom, something beyond them, even though they were themselves emancipated, even enlightened. And there's a story about Sariputra in this connection, which is typical. Sariputra was once in the presence of the Buddha, and he said to the Buddha, out of his excess of faith and devotion, he said, "Lord, I think you are the greatest of all the enlightened ones who have ever existed, or will exist, or who exist now. I think you are the greatest of them all." So the Buddha was neither pleased nor displeased by that. He didn't say, "Oh, the marvelous disciple you are, how wonderfully well you understand me." He did ask the question. He said, "Sariputra, have you known all the Buddhas of the past?" No? So Sariputra said, "No, Lord." And then he said, "Have you known all the Buddhas of the future?" "No, Lord." "Do you know all the Buddhas that are?" Then he said, "Do you even know me?" And Sariputra said, "No, Lord." And then the Buddha said, "That being the case, that being the position, how is it that your words are so bold and so grand?" So this shows that even the enlightened disciple, the wisest of the disciples, like Sariputra, didn't fully understand, didn't succeed in fathoming the Buddha. And therefore we find that after the death of the Buddha, this feeling or this attitude on the part of the disciples that the Buddha was unfathomable. That even though they were enlightened, presumably just as he was enlightened, but they didn't really understand him at all, couldn't fathom him at all, this found expression in a list of 10 powers and 18 special attributes which they built up and which they attributed to him, just to mark him off, as it were, from all the other just merely emancipated and enlightened disciples. We're not going into that now, however, but what we are concerned with and what is significant is that this all crystallized eventually into a very important distinction made with regard to the Buddha. And that's the distinction between what came to be called his Rupakaya, his physical, phenomenal appearance, and his Dharmakaya, his true form, his essential form. The Rupakaya literally means form of body, and Dharmakaya means body of truth or body of reality. The Rupakaya is the Buddha as existing in time, and Dharmakaya is the Buddha as existing out of time in the dimension of eternity. And it's the latter, the Dharmakaya, that is the real body. And this is clear, for instance, from the Buddha's admonition to Vakali. There's a monk called Vakali who was very, very devoted to the Buddha. So much that he used to go about, he used to follow the Buddha around just looking at him. He was so fascinated by the appearance and the personality of the Buddha, he just used to spend all his time just sitting and looking at the Buddha, or following him up and just looking at him. He didn't know he was teaching, he didn't have any questions to ask, he just wanted to look at the Buddha. So one day the Buddha called him and he said, "Vakali, this physical body is not me. If you want to see me, see the Dharma, see the Dharmakaya, see my true form." And we're told Vakali afterwards meditated upon this. And the same point of view is found in two very famous verses of the Dharma Sutra, one of the most important of all Buddhist texts, where the Buddha says, to Subhuti, he says, "Those who by my form did see me, by my physical appearance, and those who followed me by love, wrong the effort they engaged in, me those people will not see. From the Dharma should one see the Buddhas. From the Dharma bodies comes their guidance. Yet Dharma's true nature cannot be discerned, and no one can be conscious of it as an object." So most of us, like Vakali, try to see the Buddha in, as it were, the wrong way. Not that we should ignore the Rupakaya, the physical body, the form body, but we should take it as a symbol of the Dharmakaya, the true form and the true body. The Buddha as he is, above and beyond time, in eternity as it were, in his ultimate essence. But we must confess, we must admit that the word Buddha itself is very often a bit ambiguous. Sometimes when we say the Buddha, we mean the historical figure. For instance, we say that the Buddha spoke Margati. But here, obviously, the Buddha means the historical figure, Gautama the Buddha. But sometimes we use the word Buddha to mean the transcendental reality. As when we say, for instance, look for the Buddha within yourself. When we say look for the Buddha within yourself, we don't mean just Gautama the Buddha. We don't just mean Siddhartha. We mean the eternal, the time-transcending Buddha nature within ourselves. Broadly speaking, we may say that the Theravada school today uses the word Buddha more in the historical sense. But the Mahayana, especially Zen, uses the word Buddha more in the spiritual, more in the trans-historical sense. And for this reason we find that very often, or rather wrongly, the Mahayana is accused of deifying the Buddha, of making the Buddha into a god. But this isn't really what happens at all, as I have had occasion to explain on quite a number of occasions. There is quite a lot which could be said in this connection on this particular point, but I think I need not go into that here this morning. I think from what I have said already, that the connection between the Buddha and reality, even the Buddha and God, should be quite clear. So let's just very briefly summarize the conclusions reached so far. Enlightenment, we may say, can be looked at from 2 points of view. It can be looked at from the point of view of time, from the point of view of eternity. It can be regarded as the culmination of the evolutionary process, a process which is carried on, a culmination which is reached through and by means of personal effort. But enlightenment can also be regarded as being a sort of breakthrough into a new dimension beyond time and beyond the evolutionary process. In the same way, we can look at the Buddha in 2 ways, as Rupakaya and as Dharmakaya, as included in history and also as transcending history. And in the second case, when we regard the Buddha or Buddhahood as synonymous with reality, as occupying the dimension of eternity, as transcending time, then the Buddha figure becomes a symbol of reality itself, but not identical with God in the Western sense, because there are no theistic attributes, no question of creation of the world or anything like that, even though object of devotion. Now, before we close for the morning, before we close this morning's talk, there's, as you may remember, a promise to be kept, and that is, what does the right angle represent, or the point that the right angle represent? We can call that point X. Perhaps there ought to be an X there just to indicate that. It should be pretty clear now what it represents. We may say that the point infinity is the Rupakaya of the Buddha. Here's the evolutionary process starting at 0, going up through points 1 and 2 and 3, and culminating in the attainment of enlightenment or Buddhahood, like at the top, at the point representing marked by the sign for infinity. So that sign for infinity is the Rupakaya of the Buddha. But in addition to the Rupakaya, there is the Dharmakaya of the Buddha. The Buddha as existing out of time. The Buddha as existing in reality, in eternity. And this is the Dharmakaya. The Dharmakaya, Rupakaya. This is the evolutionary process within time. This is eternity. This is ultimate reality. In relation to zero, in relation to the infinity symbol, Rupakaya is Dharmakaya. In relation to zero symbol is what Buddhism calls the Dharma Dhatu. Reality as supporting the whole phenomenal process. Reality as expressing itself, as it were, in the whole cosmos. And the common denominator, of course, of Dharma Dhatu and Dharmakaya, this is, we may say, Shunyata, Mahashunyata, the great void, great emptiness. So this point also represents that. In itself, it is Mahashunyata. In relation to infinity, it is Dharmakaya. In relation to zero, it is Dharma Dhatu. And that's perhaps as far as we need go for today.